It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about a really exciting project. I've been listening to it all morning, and it's really interesting. It's very good. It's very different than anything that I've ever heard before. It's Jazz Vespers for the Immaculate Conception, and joining us to talk about it is Dr. J.J. Wright. Thanks for being here, Dr. Wright.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So which came first for you, your love for sacred music or love for jazz?
Well, they've kind of always lived next to one another. I guess, properly speaking, sacred music came first because when I was a little kid, I grew up Catholic, and we always grew up going to church on Sundays. I didn't hear the kind of sacred music that is on this CD in my home parish.
Uh-huh.
But as I started to study music, I was always kind of enjoying both parts of the music.
So when did you start getting into jazz? How did that happen?
I started playing jazz when I was probably right at the beginning of high school, so 14 or 15. And I remember I was driving in my car somewhere and with my parents, and I heard some jazz come on the radio. And honestly, this is a true story. I remember hearing it and thinking, man, I just hate the way that this sounds. Like, I cannot enjoy this at all. And I just kept listening. And by the time I finished the end of that, listening to that recording, I was like, I don't know why I had such an adverse reaction to that, but I got to figure out why, because there's something in there that I need to understand. And so, that kind of started this obsessive pursuit really to understand more about jazz music. And, I think that's true for a lot of different music, at least in my experience, is when you first hear it, it's foreign. And so it doesn't necessarily speak directly to our hearts. But I think, with a little bit of investment, we can really find what's beautiful inside of different types of music.
Well, and I think whenever we say jazz music, there's all kinds of different types of jazz music. And I've realized the difference between cool jazz and smooth jazz, if I tell my smart speaker to play the two. But also, and almost kind of comparing it to paintings and art, you've got things that are very ordered and beautiful and things that are more abstract. And with jazz, we've got the same thing. Some of it's kind of very straightforward and very poppy, Frank Sinatra kind of jazz, versus the more kind of dissonant and chaotic kind of stuff. And you really have, I think, a history of both types. You've kind of got a variety of jazz music that you've played over the time. Why is the chaos of jazz sometimes just as musical as the ordered?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that it's important for us to remember that jazz sort of grew up in a really important cultural context. Of course, this is truly American music, jazz. And largely, at least in its initial formations, jazz is an African-American music. So mostly played by Black musicians. And of course, this music is coming out of the Black experience, which is largely centered around the experience of slavery. So when it's framed in that context, and we can start to understand the true sort of sorrowful and expressive nature of jazz as a manifestation of this experience of oppression, a lot of the sounds can start to make a lot more sense. It makes, when you hear a singer kind of screaming in agony about wanting to be free, it makes a lot more sense, because now we're understanding that this is really coming out of that experience of slavery. And so all of these things inform my own playing of jazz music. Obviously, I don't know what that experience is like, but I find myself here now, having studied this music and having fallen in love with it. And I myself need to sort of reckon with the fact that this is an important history of this music.
So where did the idea to combine jazz music with sacred music come from?
Sort of almost out of ignorance first. It's it's kind of crazy, but these were two musics that I loved. And when I was really drawn to study sacred music more in depth, I came to Notre Dame for my master's and my doctorate. I thought I was leaving jazz behind. And when I got to Notre Dame, I'd sort of gone through this whole grieving process of, okay, now I'm moving on to do proper music, and my first semester here, I had a really great professor, and we had a class on liturgical prayer. And in this class, we were kind of studying all these different Christian forms of liturgical prayer. And I remember she would call me by my last name. She said, Wright, you're a jazz musician, right? And I said, yeah. And she said, okay, well, you're going to make a Jazz Vespers service. And I said, well, no, I can't do that. I left that behind. And she said, no, don't be ridiculous. You didn't leave that behind. And so she kind of walked with me that whole semester to really help me think it through and really understand how I could start to think about these two things together. So that was really the first time that I thought about combining things. And then this project really came out of that whole idea too. The first project was much more like a participatory service called Vespers for the Transfiguration. Mm-hmm. And it's meant for the congregation to sing along. This is kind of the other end of the spectrum where it's much more meditative. It's meant to be actively listened to. So we kind of make our way through the whole Vespers, the whole prayer experience, and in a meditative sense where we're really letting the text come over us and letting the way that the music sets them put us in a particular prayer space.
Does this go back to your dissertation that you did, is translating early Baroque oratorio to jazz? It sounds like maybe that was kind of setting you up for being able to do some of this stuff. Yeah.
It's been a huge focus of mine, kind of in my sacred music studies, because what I became interested in was the fact that, the cultural context for sacred music and jazz have often been different. But there's kind of a through line in the sense that some of the actual nuts and bolts of how the music works are very similar. It's like in the Baroque, and you can hear this on the recording, in the Salve Regina and the Magnificat, like you have what's called a basso continuo group. And it's kind of like the 17th century rhythm section. So you hear like a bass instrument, like a cello, playing the bass line, and you hear, in this case, organ playing the chords. And within those two things, there's a really strong sense of like rhythmic motion. And when you play basso continuo, when you play the keyboard, which I do on this recording, I'm using really the same types of skills I'm using when I play jazz, because the basso continuo part's not all written out and composed. The composer would just write the bass note, and then you kind of have to improvise on top of the bass note in that style.
Okay.
And so when I'm transitioning from this music back to jazz, it's very similar.
And how would you describe, because it's not just jazz music, it's really kind of like a mashup of two different genres, at least, if not more genres. So how would you describe the music?
I would say that so there's some different musical styles. We have some Gregorian chant. We have some Baroque motets. We have some sort of more classical type music that I have composed, so it's written out and everyone's parts are notated. And then we have some that's more properly jazz in the sense that it has a certain rhythmic impetus and the sections are improvised. And so what I'm doing here is I'm essentially putting together everything I can, essentially that's part of my palette, my musical palette, in order to best create an environment to enter more deeply into each prayer. And so it's kind of like Lectio Divina in a sense, because, when I'm composing these songs, I'm really actually praying with the texts. So I spend a long time really just living with the texts and literally just sitting there praying with them, reading them over and over, asking for inspiration around the texts from God. And then in this process, I'm really hoping that I'll sort of be filled with the inspiration to set this text in a way that will illuminate it for me and in turn illuminate it for the person who is listening and praying with it on the other side.
And why did you pick Vespers? And maybe also, can you explain what Vespers is and then
Sure.
why you chose that?
Yeah, so Vespers it's part of the church's prayer cycle, daily prayer cycle called the Liturgy of the Hours. Mm-hmm. And this is a prayer cycle that's said daily by millions of people around the world, mostly by religious people. It's like, if you're a nun or a monk, this is kind of the bread and butter of your prayer life. Mm-hmm. So Vespers is evening prayer. It's the prayer that we would say sometime between dinner and later in the evening. And the reason I chose Vespers for this particular piece is because, firstly, Vespers is it's kind of an open form in a sense. Like we don't have the same type of, I don't want to say restrictions, but we don't have the same type of structure in Vespers that we have in something like the Mass, for example. The other thing I love about Vespers is that Vespers is truly ecumenical. So like Christians all over the world pray Vespers because it's it's one of these things that sort of transcended any types of barriers between Christians. So I love it for that reason. And then at the same time, Vespers is just a little bit more flexible in terms of historically, there's been great examples of composers who have taken Vespers and used it as a vehicle for creating new sacred music.
Hmm. And you mentioned your previous one was the Feast of the Transfiguration. This one that just is coming out, it was the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Why these two?
So Transfiguration, I love because of a Sufjan Stevens song. That's the kind of the original impetus for why I wrote that particular piece. I based that whole Vespers around that Sufjan Stevens song. And when I was writing that one, I really wanted to think, I wanted to create a prayer service that people would really want to sing along with and had just like really great music. So that was kind of where I came up with this one. For the Immaculate Conception, when I was first composing this, I was actually composing it for a concert. And the concert itself was on December 8th. Okay. And so when I was kind of a year out, starting to think about what I wanted to do for the concert, I was like, well, that is the Immaculate Conception. It'd be so great to be able to compose something for that. As a Catholic, and I really want to stress this, like we have this sense that we sort of understand what it means to have devotion to Mary and have devotions to the saints and devotions to Jesus. But for myself, I can say that it really is a slow process. Like, do I really understand what the Immaculate Conception is unless I spend some time with it and really dig in? And I think that this is one of the things that I was hoping to do with this piece.
All right. Well, again, it's called Vespers for the Immaculate Conception. You can get it from Ignatius Press. It's available now. You can also check out Dr. Wright's music at jjwrightmusic.com. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.